World War I was a major conflict that broke out in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century and affected the entire world. To understand the causes of the war, it is necessary to examine the political, economic, and social structure of Europe at the time. From the late 19th century onwards, Europe was undergoing a period of great change and transformation. The impact of the Industrial Revolution had led to the strengthening of nations both economically and militarily. While industrial production capacity increased, the development of modern armies and arms production accelerated interstate rivalry. This competition was not only economic but also political and military in nature. Especially after the unification of Germany, the balance of power in Europe shifted. The establishment of the German Empire in 1871 caused France to lose territory and disrupted the balance of power on the continent. Germany's rapid industrialization and growing military capacity attracted the attention of other major powers, particularly Britain and France. The system of alliances in Europe played a key role in the years leading up to the war. From the late 19th century, mutual distrust and security concerns among the great powers increased. This led countries to form secret agreements and alliances with each other. For example, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance, while France, Britain, and Russia created the Triple Entente. These alliances made it possible for even a small regional conflict to escalate into a war that could affect the entire continent and beyond. Each country sought to protect itself from the aggressive policies of others. However, this situation intensified diplomatic crises and led to miscalculations. Nationalism was also one of the fundamental causes of the war. Throughout the 19th century, many ethnic groups in Europe aspired to establish their own nation-states. The Balkans, in particular, became the center of various ethnic and national movements as the Ottoman Empire weakened. While the Serbs, Montenegrins, and other South Slavic peoples fought for independence, Austria-Hungary continuously applied pressure to suppress these movements. This increased instability in the region and created a chain of crises that affected the other major powers of the continent. The arms race was another crucial factor underlying the rivalry between European states before the war. The modernization of both land and naval forces heightened the struggle for military superiority. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany was a significant factor that raised tensions in Europe. Both countries sought to gain an advantage by building new and powerful warships. This process not only diverted much of their economic resources to weapons and naval production but also reinforced the idea that war was inevitable. Economic and colonial competition was another trigger of the conflict. The great powers of Europe were engaged in a struggle for colonies both on the continent and across the world. The ongoing rivalry over colonies in Africa and Asia heightened tensions among states. As a latecomer to colonial expansion, Germany felt disadvantaged and tried to increase its influence against Britain and France's colonial holdings. This situation further deepened political and diplomatic crises in Europe. In summary, the causes of World War I were multifaceted and interconnected. Political alliances, nationalism, the arms race, economic and colonial rivalries formed the cornerstones of the growing tension among European countries. In such an atmosphere, a single spark could ignite a great conflict that would engulf the entire continent. Indeed, in 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo became that spark, plunging Europe into a devastating war that would last for years. The spark that ignited World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. The assassination was carried out by the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip, and this event directly triggered the tense alliance system in Europe. Austria-Hungary took a hard stance against Serbia and soon, on July 23, 1914, issued an ultimatum. The ultimatum contained provisions that severely restricted Serbia's independence and national sovereignty. Although Serbia accepted most of the demands, it objected to some. Austria-Hungary used this as a pretext and declared war on Serbia on July 28. This small regional conflict quickly turned into a large-scale war that engulfed Europe, as countries began to act according to their alliance obligations. Germany sided with Austria-Hungary and rapidly entered the war. Germany had already planned its conflicts with France and Russia, known as the Schlieffen Plan. The aim of the Schlieffen Plan was for Germany to achieve a quick victory in the west by defeating France swiftly, while also fighting Russia in the east. The plan involved invading Belgium to launch an attack on France. After the war began, Germany put the plan into action and invaded Belgium on August 4, 1914, advancing toward France. This invasion led Britain to declare war on Germany, as Britain had guaranteed international treaties protecting Belgium's neutrality. Thus, in a short time, Europe was dragged into a major war. The first months of the war were marked by rapidly shifting fronts and large movements. On the Western Front, Germany's rapid advance was met with resistance from French and British forces. However, the fighting in Belgium and northern France caused massive losses and destruction. As the German army advanced toward Paris, the French army and the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, launched counterattacks. These maneuvers culminated in a major battle around the Marne River. The Battle of the Marne was a critical turning point, halting Germany's goal of a swift victory and turning the war into a prolonged trench conflict. On the Eastern Front, the situation was different. Although Russia had a large and populous army, it faced great difficulties against German and Austro-Hungarian forces due to logistical problems and lack of coordination. However, Russia's early involvement in the war meant that Austria-Hungary's operations in Serbia were supported and that Germany had to divide its forces on the Eastern Front. This complicated Germany's plans in the West. In the early months, Russia suffered heavy losses at battles such as Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, but still created pressure that limited German forces in the West. At the beginning of the war, it was thought that the conflict would last only a few months. However, this expectation quickly changed due to the nature of the war and the strategies applied. Trench warfare, especially on the Western Front, became a permanent feature. While trenches protected soldiers from enemy fire, they also resulted in static and bloody confrontations. During this period, millions of soldiers struggled to survive under harsh conditions, while disease and logistical difficulties weakened the armies. Both sides suffered huge losses for minimal territorial gains. Major battles such as Verdun and the Somme were rooted in the trench warfare of these early months. Naval strategies also played an important role at the start of the war. Britain's powerful navy aimed to blockade Germany's trade routes and naval bases. In response, Germany began attacking merchant ships with submarines, U-boats, thus opening a second dimension of the conflict at sea. Naval blockades affected both economies and civilian life, expanding the global scale of the war. In summary, the beginning of World War I transformed from a small regional conflict into a widespread war that engulfed all of Europe. The tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, with the involvement of Germany and its allies, escalated into a continent-wide conflict. The first months were characterized by rapid advances, counterattacks, and preparations for trench warfare. During this period, it became clear that the war would last far longer than expected and claim the lives of millions. The bloodiest and most destructive front of World War I was undoubtedly the Western Front. Germany's advance into France through Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan shaped the Western Front during the early stages of the war. However, the German army's defeat at the Battle of the Marne led to the failure of the plan and laid the groundwork for prolonged trench warfare. Trench warfare completely changed the character of the war and dramatically increased the hardships faced by soldiers. During this period, the Western Front stretched across French and Belgian territory with hundreds of kilometers of parallel trench lines. The trenches were not only a military strategy but also turned into a deadly trap. Trenches were dug primarily to protect soldiers from enemy fire. However, this protection also brought immobility and the constant feeling of being under threat. Soldiers were forced to remain for long periods in trenches filled with mud and water, with poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. Diseases, particularly typhus and gas poisoning, became widespread among troops. The no man's land between the trenches became the most evident symbol of death. This area, lying between opposing trenches and constantly under bombardment, was littered with rubble and craters. Soldiers attempting an attack across this zone faced an almost certain risk of death. The main characteristic of the Western Front was prolonged and bloody battles. The battles of Verdun and the Somme became symbols of trench warfare and caused the deaths of millions. The Battle of Verdun, which lasted for about 10 months in 1916, brought immense destruction between French and German forces. It tested the endurance of soldiers while also serving as a critical turning point that influenced morale and the overall strategy of the war. The Battle of the Somme, on the other hand, highlighted the involvement of the British Army and demonstrated the application of modern warfare tactics. Both battles revealed that the war was not only a military conflict but also a source of psychological and social trauma. Trench warfare became a testing ground for new military technologies. Artillery bombardments, machine guns, poison gas, and tanks were elements that transformed the nature of the war. Artillery fire destroyed trenches and demoralized soldiers. Machine guns made mass troop movements nearly impossible and turned counterattacks into bloodbaths. Poison gases, especially chlorine and mustard gas, spread fear and panic among soldiers and caused long-term health problems. These technologies dramatically increased the destructive impact of the war on human life and made the days spent in the trenches even more unbearable. Strategic offensives and operations on the Western Front were generally designed in such a way that enormous losses were incurred for minimal gains. After hours of bombardments and assaults, soldiers often managed to advance only a few hundred meters. This prolonged the war and caused devastating consequences for both soldiers and civilians. The static nature of the conflict also strained supply and logistics lines while exerting heavy psychological pressure. The parallel structure of the trenches turned the war into a frozen tableau, symbolizing its long and exhausting character. This period of the war caused dramatic changes in the lives of both soldiers and civilians. Soldiers had to cope with the constant threat of death, psychological trauma, and stress. This situation laid the foundation for post-war trauma and the mental disorder known as shell shock. Civilians, particularly in Belgium and northern France, suffered greatly due to bombardments and occupations. Cities and villages were devastated, thousands of people were forced to flee, and living conditions worsened drastically. This demonstrated that the war left lasting effects not only on the battlefield but also on society as a whole. The prolonged trench warfare on the Western Front turned the war into a tool of exploitation and psychological pressure. Both sides were forced to suffer heavy losses for small advances. Strategically, the trenches were critical for both defense and offense, and this situation led to the war becoming an endless cycle. During this period, soldiers faced some of the harshest and most destructive conditions in human history. This aspect of the war revealed not only military success or failure, but also the value of human life and the devastating power of war. In summary, the Western Front and trench warfare were among the most defining elements of World War I. While trenches protected soldiers from enemy fire, they also caused the war to progress slowly and bloodily. Major battles such as Verdun and the Somme went down as some of the most destructive clashes in human history. Technological innovations increased both the tactics and the destructiveness of the war. The Western Front became a nightmare and a site of devastation not only for soldiers but also for civilians. This period was of critical importance for understanding the prolonged and dramatic nature of World War I. Unlike the Western Front, World War I's Eastern Front unfolded across a much larger and more variable geography. While trench warfare and static battles dominated the Western Front, the Eastern Front was characterized by mobile warfare over vast areas. Although Russia entered the war with a massive population, it was weak in terms of industry and logistics compared to Germany and Austria-Hungary. This prevented Russia from gaining strategic superiority and led to heavy losses. However, Russia's offensives on the Eastern Front limited Germany's ability to deploy more forces in the West and influenced the overall balance of the war. One of the first major battles of the war was the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914. In this clash, the German army inflicted a devastating defeat on Russian forces. Tannenberg became a major morale victory for Germany and exposed the unprepared and fragmented structure of the Russian army. Although Russia tried to recover after this defeat, the continuous fighting along the Eastern Front, combined with heavy losses and logistical difficulties, kept it under constant pressure. Russia's weak industrial base severely restricted the supply of ammunition and weapons, negatively affecting soldier morale. Another defining feature of the Eastern Front was that its lines were far longer than those on the Western Front. This created significant logistical and supply problems for both sides. Despite the high mobility of troops, providing food, weapons, and ammunition posed enormous challenges. Harsh winter conditions placed additional strain on soldiers, increasing disease and hardship. These factors showed that the war was shaped not only by combat but also by environmental and logistical struggles. The Ottoman Empire also played an important role on the Eastern Front. Entering the war in 1914, the Ottomans actively engaged in both the Caucasus and Middle Eastern theaters. In the Caucasus, Ottoman forces clashed with the Russians, conducting defensive and counter-offensive operations in strategically critical regions. In the Middle East, they fought against the British and the Arab Revolt. The Ottoman entry expanded the war fronts and gave the conflict a global dimension. The Gallipoli campaign became a striking example of Ottoman resilience. British and French attempts to advance toward Istanbul were halted by determined Ottoman defense, providing the empire with a significant morale boost. The Balkans also emerged as a crucial front. At the start of the war, Austria-Hungary attempted to occupy Serbia, but early Serbian resistance proved successful. However, with Bulgaria's entry into the war and the support of Austria-Hungary and Germany, Serbia was eventually placed in a dire situation. The Balkan conflicts deepened ethnic and national tensions in the region and paved the way for redrawing borders after the war. This front reflected both the military and diplomatic dimensions of the conflict. On the eastern and other fronts, the war was more mobile compared to the west. Large territorial gains or losses could occur in short periods, but coordination issues between fronts and logistical difficulties limited the effectiveness of both sides. This dynamic caused the war to progress with different characteristics in different regions. The vastness of the fronts increased the human and material costs of the war. The clashes between Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary had devastating effects on millions of soldiers. Other theaters of war also witnessed resistance and strategic maneuvers. German colonies in Africa were besieged by British and French forces. Battles in the Pacific Islands highlighted the global dimension of the conflict. This demonstrated that World War I was not confined to Europe but affected many regions worldwide. Naval warfare also played a critical role, influencing interfront connections and global supply routes. In summary, the Eastern Front and other theaters revealed that World War I had a very different character from the Western Front. Vast geographical areas, mobile battles, logistical challenges, and diverse strategic maneuvers highlighted the complexity of the war in these regions. Russia's weak industrial base, the Ottoman Empire's strategic defenses, and the conflicts in the Balkans and beyond gave the war a multidimensional and global nature. These fronts showed that the war was not merely about static battles in Europe but a chain of events that impacted the entire world. World War I marked one of the first major conflicts in human history where technology and modern weapons directly influenced the course of war. From 1914 to 1918, one of the most defining factors of the war was the extensive use of new military technologies. Weapons during this period not only became more lethal but also fundamentally altered strategies and tactics. Tanks, poisonous gas, machine guns, aircraft, and submarines brought the conflict to a scale different from previous wars. Machine guns were among the characteristic weapons of World War I. They directly contributed to the deadly nature of trench warfare, especially on the Western Front. Their intense firepower made enemy assaults almost impossible and severely restricted the movement of soldiers. Counterattacks from the trenches often resulted in high casualties due to machine gun fire. This situation forced tactical changes and required soldiers to move cautiously between trenches. Machine guns increased the static and exhausting nature of the war, making life in the trenches even more unbearable. Poisonous gases were another devastating weapon used in the war. Chlorine and mustard gas, in particular, were employed to create fear and panic among soldiers. Gas attacks lowered morale and caused long-term health problems. Despite the development of gas masks and defensive measures, gas could be deadly and increased chaos on the battlefield. These weapons raised ethical questions and challenged the boundaries of wartime law, acting as a destructive force affecting soldiers both psychologically and physically. Tanks represented another technological innovation that changed the course of the war. They were first used by the British during the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Tanks were designed to cross trench lines and break enemy defenses. However, mechanical issues and slow movement initially limited their effectiveness. Still, tanks eventually became an instrument providing tactical advantages, representing the technological evolution of warfare. Aircraft were used for both reconnaissance and combat. Initially employed for observation and intelligence, they soon became active in bombing and aerial combat. Air warfare added a new dimension to the conflict, forcing soldiers to defend not only against threats on land but also from attacks from the sky. Aircraft technology advanced rapidly, integrating with weapon systems and establishing the sky as a new battlefield. Submarines and naval warfare also played a critical role. Germany, particularly through U-boats, targeted Britain's sea routes and trade lines. Submarine attacks posed threats to both civilian and military vessels, while naval blockades intensified the economic impact of the war. The Royal Navy took continuous measures to limit Germany's efforts. Submarine technology gave the war a global dimension and emphasized the importance of supply lines. Significant advances were also made in artillery and bombardment techniques. High-capacity artillery was used to destroy trench lines and neutralize enemy positions. These weapons increased casualties and amplified the destructive impact of the war. Artillery bombardments, often during the so-called preparatory fire, had a profound effect on soldiers in the trenches. Technological developments affected not only tactics and strategy but also the psychological and social dimensions of war. Soldiers faced increasing levels of fear and stress as they encountered new and deadly weapons. The trauma experienced on the battlefield affected not only combatants but also civilian populations and societies. Technology made the war deadlier, more exhausting, and more extensive in scope. In summary, World War I clearly demonstrated the impact of technology on warfare. Machine guns, poisonous gas, tanks, aircraft, and submarines fundamentally changed the character of the conflict. These weapons not only threatened the lives of soldiers but also influenced military tactics, strategies, and the duration of the war. Military technology laid the foundation for modern warfare and directly contributed to shaping one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. After the end of World War I, efforts began to establish a new world order among the victorious and defeated powers. The most concrete example of these efforts was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. The treaty officially ended the war and became the most important diplomatic document defining Germany's post-war obligations. However, Versailles was more than just a peace agreement. It fundamentally reshaped the political, economic, and social balance of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy burdens on Germany. Germany suffered territorial losses. The Alsace-Lorraine region was returned to France. Poland was established as a new state, and Germany's eastern and western borders were redrawn. Germany also lost all of its colonies and was required to pay war reparations. These reparations placed tremendous pressure on the German economy and laid the groundwork for post-war economic crises. The treaty also restricted Germany's military capacity, limiting the army to 100,000 soldiers, banning the production of tanks and aircraft, and drastically reducing the navy. These limitations weakened Germany both defensively and strategically. Another important aspect of the Versailles Treaty was its impact on Europe's post-war political structure. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to the creation of new states such as Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The partitioning of the Ottoman Empire and the Treaty of Sèvres redrew borders in the Middle East. This process redefined ethnic and national boundaries, creating new political tensions and conflicts in the post-war period. Europe's map changed significantly, and international relations were reshaped according to a new order. The treaty also had profound social effects. Economic hardships in Germany caused widespread dissatisfaction and unrest among the population. Post-war unemployment, inflation, and shortages placed German society under severe strain. These adverse conditions created fertile ground for radical political movements and extremist ideologies. The Versailles Treaty is considered one of the fundamental causes of political instability in Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, ultimately contributing to the outbreak of World War II. Economically, the war and the treaty deeply affected European economies. The conflict, which resulted in millions of deaths, reduced production capacity, destroyed infrastructure, and lowered agricultural output. Germany's war reparations made economic recovery difficult and necessitated the reconstruction of financial systems across Europe. The global dimension of the war also positioned the United States at the center of the world economy, shaping post-war economic relations. The treaty's impact on international relations was significant as well. The League of Nations was established to preserve post-war peace and resolve international disputes. However, the United States' refusal to join the League and Germany's exclusion limited its effectiveness. Rather than ensuring lasting peace, the treaty created new problems. Border changes and economic obligations generated dissatisfaction, particularly in Germany and other defeated nations, paving the way for future international conflicts. The cultural and societal impacts of the war were also profound. Millions of lives were lost, families were broken, and social fabrics were disrupted. The war deeply influenced literature, art, and intellectual thought, with tragic experiences and losses inspiring new themes in cultural production. The devastation of the war highlighted the importance of peace, human rights, and international cooperation in the years that followed. In summary, the Treaty of Versailles and the consequences of the war brought profound changes for both Germany and Europe. The treaty imposed heavy obligations and territorial restrictions on Germany, leading to economic and political challenges. Europe's political map was redrawn, new states were established, and ethnic balances shifted. Social and cultural effects created trauma and change in post-war societies. The establishment of the League of Nations emphasized the importance of international cooperation, but the treaty's shortcomings and perceived injustices laid the groundwork for future conflicts. Although the Treaty of Versailles officially marked the end of World War I, the war's effects and outcomes continued to shape world history for many years. World War I was not just a military conflict. It was a turning point that fundamentally altered the social, economic, and political structure of the modern world. With millions of lives lost, cities destroyed, and national borders redrawn, the war became one of the most devastating and instructive experiences in human history. Its consequences shaped the political, economic, and cultural decisions of subsequent generations.